many, many headaches and many problems. But in the end, you know, again, just with Pale Folklore, it's we can look back on it with pride and think that we basically tackled this big monster of an album that we're trying to create. And I still look back on it and I listen to it very often, and I'm very, very proud of it.
The Mantle was an album that was created during a period of time when we were not so interested in metal anymore. Kind of took a break from it. I was really not interested in what was going on in the scene or any new bands at that time. And plus, right after we recorded Pale Folklore, I left for Finland for a while. And while in Finland, I became very aware and a big fan of electronic music. And, you know, so I kind of brought that back when I came back. And, you know, we were very much into the so-called neo-folk scene, more than we'd ever had been in the past. And as well as like the whole industrial kind of scene from the 80s, early 90s, like bands like Swans, Liabach, and of course some newer sort of post-rock stuff like Mogwai and Godspeed You Black Emperor, and, you know, Sugar Rose and stuff like that at the time. So all of those kind of influences, those non-metal influences, really pooled together on that album. And once again, when we were creating that album in the studio, I kind of told the engineer, you know, well, this album is basically sort of like traveling from Portland to Mount Hood and back in a way, because the way the songs are structured together in that album, aesthetically and atmospherically, is kind of like the album starts at Crown Point, where the photograph of us was taken for the vinyl. That sort of panoramic vista, and it travels down through the old highway towards Hood River. And then if you take Hood River to Mount Hood, and you go through the mountains and the wilderness and stuff, and then back to Portland, and then back to Crown Point. And so it kind of that whole album follows this kind of circle that ends kind of where it began. Obviously, you would only understand that if you're from Portland or from this area. But that was kind of the basis that we built that album on, and it's very different than what I think a lot of metal bands do. You know, especially a lot of bands that I don't want to say pretend to be something they're not, but, you know, who utilize their local influences. I mean, that's basically how we utilized ours. And I think from an outside perspective, that album might sound a little bit confused, but it makes perfect sense if you're from this area. And that was our Portland album, basically.
Portland is a very important place for me, and I really think that the Mantle really encompasses so much of the aesthetics and so much of the vibe of Portland, not only the artwork, but the music, the themes. And I think that if you listen to the Mantle and you're familiar with Portland, you will get the references. You can understand where Hawthorne Passage comes from, and Desolation Song and things like that. You can really appreciate and understand where the lyrics, where the themes are coming from, the imagery. It all wraps up, and it just, the whole thing just screams Portland.
And then, you know, after we'd done the Mantle, it was, you know, we looked back on it and we felt like maybe we need to really redefine and refine the sound. And so we wanted to make Ashes a bit more of a succinct statement. It's more of a back to basics record, which I don't think there was anything else we could do after the sort of sprawling, you know, miasmic recording of the Mantle. And so we really sort of stripped down, and I think what was interesting about Ashes as it gets to the grain was that our experience of redeveloping to a live act where we had to cut back in order to present tracks from the Mantle into a live context with just two guitars, bass, vocals, and drums. It taught us what we could do with very little. And so I think we kept the album basic as a sort of inspiration from playing live, and that's always usually been inverted.
Ashes Against the Grain was an album that we had to do at the time. We had really immersed ourselves so much into the Mantle that we just needed to have an album that was just, that kind of rocked more. It was a bit more stripped down, and it was just pure energy and emotion. Because the Mantle was definitely not that. It was more subdued. And so also at the time that we were writing Ashes, I was kind of having a renaissance with metal again, because I was really listening to a lot of bands that I had discovered, a lot of newer bands at the time, as well as a lot of cold wave stuff like Antarctica and once again Sigur Rós and bands like Thule from Norway, the prog band, and we were listening to a lot of dark progressive rock. So once again those influences came together, and we just created this album that was a bit more stripped down, and it just rocked more. And I think people were kind of afraid of what we were going to do when I gave that press release saying that it's a bit more rock based. But I think that album is one of our heaviest albums because it is so focused on electric guitars. And
when we started writing and recording for Ashes, we really decided that we wanted to make a little bit more of a stripped down album. And it was the first album that we recorded after we became a live working band, touring, playing shows. And because of that, it really changed the way that we wrote the music and the way we approached the music. With an album like The Mantle, the sky was the limit. With an album like Ashes, we really wanted to kind of make it just more compact, more stripped down, and a really powerful statement.
Amidst the 3 full lengths, I think we've always really wanted to take our time between them and use that time to sort of indulge ourselves and experiment with what I would consider to be the more marginal sounds of Agalloch. So for example, we wanted to do a noisier rock sort of recording, and we wouldn't want to do a full length like that. And so we came along with doing the Lodge and reworking it for the live, which led to doing this EP, the Grey EP. But and the same thing too with the White EP being a sort of straight folk EP. For my theory for these EPs is that we don't want them to be major statements of our discography. For me, when you hear the full length, you're hearing the center of Agalloch, whereas the EPs are kind of the margins, it's kind of the fringe. It's where I feel like we had the most freedom to really indulge ourselves and really develop some of the more fringier aspects of our sound, which I think ultimately helps define our overall sound that we finally release on a full length. But that's why we like to limit them, and that's why we like to continue doing them, and I think that's something that we'll always do as just a way to continue playing with and experimenting our sound.
Well, the EPs that we release, they're studies. They're a way for us to kind of step away from the album process, which is very developed and very, there's a lot that goes into that, and kind of step away from those kind of pressures and put out something that's just either a study of a certain aesthetic or just for something that's just enjoyable, like that split 10-inch that we did with our friend over in Finland, in Nest. That was a pure joy to record, and there was no pressure in the studio, and it was fantastic. And the same could be said about the Grey EP and the White EP and all of that stuff. Like I said, it's a way for us to just kind of step back and study a certain aesthetic, and sometimes the study pays off and we end up using certain things, certain elements of that on our next recording.
With the Grey EP in particular, I did a remix of Odal, and with that I took little tiny samples of different pieces of the guitars, of the drums, and I made this kind of massive piece of noise. Basically it was ambient noise.